Hey everybody, and welcome to video number 2 on chapter 16, where we'll be discussing the economy and a quick little note about the society in classical India. And with the economy, we're going to start talking about agriculture. Now, agriculture in India revolves around these things called the monsoons. You guys should remember what those are. Monsoons are seasonal winds. In the summertime, they come out of the south. In the wintertime, they come out of the north. And the southern summer winds, they bring kind of warm moisture with them. They bring a lot of rain, and in the winter months they bring more kind of drier, not necessarily cold, but a little chillier winds, definitely drier. And agriculture and trade in the Indian subcontinent and in the Indian Ocean, it completely revolves around the monsoons. If you have favorable monsoons, you have good crops. Likewise, even trade routes are dependent on them. It made developing irrigation techniques very, very essential. In the north, where you have most of your rivers, you could get an awful lot of flooding and make scenes like this very, very common. Even to this day, you see, in this photograph of digging ditches and things of that nature. In the south, you really needed it for a very, very arid climate. Not getting enough moisture from the summer winds could result in significant drought in southern India. It made things like dams and reservoirs and canals, vital, and they all started to appear in larger numbers. So knowledge of the monsoon season and good irrigation systems led to an increase in crop production. And when you have an increase in crop production, this leads to population increase, right? More food equals more people. This started to increase rapidly in the 9th and 10th centuries. Even before then, in the year 600, India's population stood at roughly about 50 million people. 200 years later, the year 800, it was around 65 million. 200 years after that, in the year 1000 CE, topped off at about 80 million. You get the idea. I don't have to write million. And then finally, it tapered off a little bit after that. You didn't see quite as stark increases over the next couple of centuries. Then started to pick up again by the year 14 and 1500. And by 1500, it was the first time that it reached over 100 million, where you had about 105 million. So pretty impressive increase over this time period. And with increases in population, that's going to lead to urbanization. People are moving to cities more. All right, you look at the different cities around the early Delhi Sultanate days. Delhi right here was the second largest city in the Muslim world after Cairo. So, it had about 400,000 people in it. So it was a pretty big metropolis by those standards. And port cities as well, right? You got all of these cities that grow along the exterior of it because of all the merchants coming up and sitting in shops. A number of these cities had populations over 100,000. Now, speaking of port cities, that leads us into trade. Important thing to remember, in the last chapter, we talked an awful lot about decentralization. Decentralization sometimes can kind of give the impression of destabilization. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case when it comes to trade in India. Decentralization did not hurt trade. The Rajas, the princes, they all put a high emphasis on trade. So even in the absence of a centralized imperial rule, trade continued to prosper. And also larger populations. That leads to more jobs. It leads to more trade, specialization, things of that nature. In India, you have regional commodities. Most regions were agriculturally self-sufficient, meaning that they didn't really have to trade with other regions for things like wheat and grain. It allowed them to concentrate more on specialty goods. In the Gangetic Plain down in here, especially in the mouth of the Ganges, this focused on iron production a lot, all right, for making weapons and armor and things of that nature. Copper, that was big down in the Deccan Plateau. Salt was big here on the coastal regions, right? You had salt there. Literally, they would mine the salt out of the sea. Pepper. Pepper was big in this whole region in southern India. And this was big money for these people, right? The merchant guilds that would emerge. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a minute. They controlled the production of it and the trade and so forth. And also the relative stability of southern India compared to northern India. Remember, we talked about that in the last video. Northern India was a lot more violent. It resulted in more economic prosperity. All right, let me get rid of this stuff first here. There we go. So, Indian Ocean trade. India is in the crossroads, as you can see on this map. It's right in the middle of these trade routes between West Asia, otherwise known as the Middle East, and East Africa, and Asia, including Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, even some of these Chinese ports as well. It turned India into very, very valuable real estate when it came to this cross-regional trade. The Indian merchants, they did business with Arab merchants, with African merchants, with people from Borneo and Sumatra, with Chinese merchants that were coming through, and so forth. And in turn, they would travel all over the place as well. Indian merchants favored the dhow, DHOW, as opposed to the big Chinese junks that we talked about in the previous one. They were smaller, lighter ships with a triangular sail. They were pretty easy to maneuver in the monsoon winds. What you also saw with this cross-regional trade was specialized production. Different regions focused on different things, right? The expansion of trade led to lands engaging in specialized production. For instance, Indian cotton. That became big time money for the Indian textile industry. It was in Indian cotton textiles were in high demand. Additionally, iron, right? That was very, very prominent. Other areas concentrate on other goods. In China, you had silk, you had porcelain. Yeah, my great handwriting. East Asia, you had spices. The Middle East, you had things like horses, dates, coffee, and I'll stop writing that. East Africa, you had gold, you had ivory, and you had slaves. These were all part of a big cross-regional trade network. And you look at India right smack dab in the middle of it. So that led to an awful lot of cross-regional kind of cultural diffusion. It also led to a lot of money being exchanged through India. All right, I said that it wasn't just going to be about the economy. We're also going to be talking a little bit about society, and that's with the caste system. So we know what the caste system is, kind of this social order tied in with Hinduism. But during this time period, in this classical era, you see an awful lot of changes. And there are a number of causes for changes. Things like migrations, right? The Turkish migrations as they were coming in across the Khyber Pass that we talked about in the last one. Economic changes with the increase in trade, population starts to go up. Not everyone's going to be fitting into these nice little four categories of Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras anymore. So another thing that's important to remember, though, the caste system was never a strictly rigid social structure. There was always an awful lot of flexibility to it. Look at the Turkish migrations as an example. As these guys started to come in, they were kind of just assimilated into the caste system. They made up new castes at times, but in many cases, they started to kind of, intermarry, and they developed, different subcastes and so forth. You also saw social change. This was largely due to trade. Trade brought an awful lot of economic expansion, and it also brought social changes. People generally identified by their jati, right, their subcastes. This often took the form of worker guilds during this period. So these merchant guilds, they would develop into subcastes. So artisans, so iron traders, or copper traders, or salt traders, or so forth. Aside from being economic identifiers, in terms of just their job, they also became part of the caste system, where people could only marry into them, and they start to have stricter rules about interactions and so forth. So you start to see a lot more of an overlap between economic guilds and social and religious caste system. Lastly, you saw expansion of the caste system during this time. The caste system expanded geographically besides becoming more complex. It originated, let me just get rid of this other part so it doesn't get in the way. It originated up here in the north along the Indus River Valley because this is where the Aryans came in from, right? Centuries before even we're talking about now. Well, it started to really work its way farther south, and it became more and more entrenched in southern India with the expansion of trade. As these merchant and craft guilds started to look at themselves as being jati, not just jobs, it strengthened the caste system. And, to this day, it's something that is still found throughout all corners of India. So that's it for video number 2. And the next one we'll talk a bit about religion.